Hi, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, the last time we will be looking at the week's news in 2020, and quite a year, and indeed quite a week it has been. Joining us this week is Carol Giacomo, Fall Fellow at the Harvard Institute's John F. Kennedy School's Institute of Politics and former member of the New York Times editorial board, as well as longtime journalist for the AP. Carol, wonderful to have you. Also with us from London is Philip Stevens, Associate Editor of the Financial Times, Chief Political Commentator for the paper and Chair of the Editorial Board of the Financial Times. Philip, wonderful to have you back here as well. And Matt Kaminski, Editor-in-Chief of Politico and Founding Editor of Politico Europe, back with us from Washington. Thanks all so much for joining us today. Lots to discuss as we go towards the end of the year. But Matt, let's start with you, and really, what is the bombshell, if cyber weapons can be bombshells, of this week? The hack, apparently by Russia, of not only major parts of the U.S. government, but major corporations of the United States, and indeed, we're now learning in other parts of the world. Politico was a leading reporter on this. She broke a bunch of the big stories, so congrats on that. Tell us a little bit about what happened and what we know so far.
Usually you expect Russia to be in the picture in October during an election year, but this time the surprise was that Russia had been fairly quiet during the campaign, but in December we got the news that in the spring, apparently, so the Russian version of the CIA had managed to infiltrate via a contractor that services a lot of government departments and agencies, and essentially hack into, but we don't really know how widespread it is, but hack into the agencies that oversee our nuclear arsenal, the agency, the Defense Department, other departments across the government. It is said to be the worst hack in recent memory. I think it sounds like the government only found out about it via another private contractor fairly recently, and is now trying to figure out just how much did the Russians get. The last time something like this happened was when the Chinese were able to hack into the OMB systems and get tons of personal information about millions of Americans. I think in this case, there's an assumption we didn't get to the most sensitive parts. They do not control our nuclear codes, it sounds like, but more of the day-to-day business, access to emails, access to American thinking about a treasury, about who in Russia might be sanctioned. So it is quite shocking, and it was quite a story to end out the year.
Carol, I remember, in fact, when I was at NATO, it was the then Secretary of Defense who came there and talked about a cyber Pearl Harbor as his biggest fear. Not that if it were come, it would be a big bang. It looks like this one may be as bad as anybody has ever seen, and yet it penetrated into our systems, and the Russians seem to be dealing with it without that big bang. How do we think about the damage that is done, and in terms of today and tomorrow and long term? And you're still on, Carol.
I'll get this technology down one day. So here's the thing. The extraordinary thing is some of the senators who were briefed on this week, including Dick Durbin, used very, very strong language to express how they, what their conclusions were after they received the classified briefing. Dick Durbin, in fact, I think said it was close declaration of war, the impact of this cyber attack on the United States. So, So members of Congress, Democratic members of Congress, certainly have been speaking out. The astonishing thing, of course, is that Trump has been silent. Here's the President of the United States, who has sworn an oath of office to protect and defend the country, and he's not talking about it. in one sense, it is extraordinary precisely because that's his responsibility. In another, it's not, because he has been silent about Russia and Russia's perfidies for his entire presidency. So this is obviously a very serious breach from everything we know about it. The experts say it's going to take months, maybe years, to sort the whole thing out, understand the true impact. There's talk of 18,000 agencies, companies altogether having been affected. And the next thing is for the United States to decide how it is going to respond. It seems unlikely that Trump is going to do it, so it will be left to Biden to figure out an appropriate response. And Putin seems to be quite emboldened because the United States has largely let Russia get away with what it's doing, not just in the cyberspace, but in other areas of the world as well.
I want to get back to that in a minute on the response, but Philip, first to you. How is the news being absorbed in the UK so far? I don't think UK government agencies appear to have been affected, but the relationship between the United States government and the UK government on cyber and other cooperation is probably closer than between any other two countries. So how is it being viewed from London?
Well, the message that people in Whitehall are trying to give out is that GCHQ, which is our equivalent of the NSA, is working extremely carefully with the NSA on this hack and looking very closely at both whether UK companies and UK entities, government entities are affected, also European. There isn't any surprise if you go to the GCHQ headquarters in southern England, a place called Cheltenham, they have this big board there with little lights on it, real-time lights, and they go on and off as hacks are coming in. They sort of track them, and most of them you can see are coming from China, and then the next ones are coming from Russia. The problem, though, is, what are the rules of the road here? We all spy on each other. You can be sure that British intelligence, American intelligence, French are trying to get in to the Russian Defense Department to find their secrets. The problem with cyber is that there are no rules. There are no, so what is espionage and what is an act of war? Where do you draw that line between, what adversaries do to each other and what crosses that line? Now, this is obviously a huge hack, but if we had successfully hacked into the Russian military system, wouldn't we be saying, probably, well, that's pretty good, isn't it? So, this is an area where, because there are no rules of the road, it's quite difficult, one, to say what crosses the line, and two, to say what's the appropriate retaliation if it has crossed the line. Do you expel a load of Russian diplomats? I don't know.
Matt, I think this is the core, right? Is it an act of war? Is it espionage? Is this business as usual with new tools, or is this something really fundamentally different, and therefore you need a different kind of response?
I think Philip makes a great point that, one, if we had done this, I'm pretty sure the Russian media would not be writing about it, and we'd be very proud of ourselves. I think the real question here is how we deal with Russia. There's a fine bipartisan tradition in this century, in this country, of being soft on Russia. George W. Bush was looking into Putin's soul. Barack Obama proposed a restart in relations. Donald Trump was quite obsequious with Putin. And the reason why we do that is because we are refusing to acknowledge that Russia is not a global power, but it is a hybrid threat to us. And yet we actually do want big things from Russia. We think that if we have a solution in Syria, we need the Russians. If we want to push on arms control, we need the Russians. In dealing with Russia's neighborhood, we need the Russians. So we take them as a big power. and yet Putin continues to behave as, mischief is the way that he keeps us on our toes, and Russia is in some ways a rogue state. So do you treat it as a rogue, or do you treat it as a serious player in global politics? The default has always been to the latter, whereas I think Putin defaults to the former. And until a US administration resolves that contradiction and decides that we're going to punish them hard enough for being rogues, and only then we are willing to engage with them as a serious power, then Putin is going to continue to do this because it completely fits in his interest to keep us unstable. And it gives him a much larger role in global affairs than actually Russia would merit otherwise.
So Carol, jump in here, because of course Biden has already made pretty strong statements that he will raise the cost, and Biden, perhaps unlike all the others that his predecessors that Matt pointed out, he comes into office with a pretty a good sense that Russia is that rogue power and needs to be dealt with, in contrast to many of his predecessors. So do you expect the kind of strong language and action on the part of the incoming administration, given what's happening, but also given the predilection?
A couple of things. One, I think that first of all, we have to say the United States has a role here. We did not protect our systems. We have an entire billion dollar budget, and an agency, a number of agencies whose job is supposed to be to protect our systems. They seem to fail in this regard. We have to figure out how what mistakes the United States made. Second of all, the idea that somehow the United States doesn't know how to deal with Russia, I think, misses the history. When Russia was the Soviet Union, and it was an existential, it was actually an existential threat to the United States because of the hair trigger position we were on with each other and the number of weapons we had and just sort of the nature of the politics. We still dealt with them on other issues. We negotiated with them on human rights. We talked about, the integration of Soviet Jews. I mean, we talked about regional issues. It wasn't always, successful. And there were, we pushed back in lots of ways. But my feeling is there is something to be learned from history, that when we have to deal with a country because it's important for whatever reasons, there should be ways that we can find to deal with it. And to the Biden point, yes, I mean, Biden was obviously vice president at the end of, Obama's, when they left office before Trump came in, and dealt with the issue of the Russian intrusion in that 2016 election. And so they do have experience with that, and they have a very competent team, and hopefully they'll be able to put together a strategy that will be effective.
But do you see, if Biden does come out and with a stronger stance towards Russia, do you see him being able to rally all the European allies towards a common position on Russia, which in some sense we have, but in another sense we don't?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the Europeans have toughened up on Russia since Ukraine, but also since the various attempts at murdering people in other people's countries in the UK, and then trying to murder the opposition leader. And Angela Merkel is a lot tougher on Russia now than she was 2 or 3 years ago. I think there is still a question, which is it possible to do a reset? Is it? And the French have been pushing that somewhat. And I think, I think it's a combination of things. There are some countries, because they're close to Russia, because of the history, that will always want to appease slightly Moscow. I think there are other countries, including, I would say, the UK, who'd say, look, it's worth having one more try, but let's have engagement, but let's not have appeasement. Let's not, let's make it absolutely clear that if you are prepared to play by the rules, maybe there are areas, missile, I mean, keeping alive, if you like, the nuclear treaties that we should be working together on. But we're not going to go down the road of, letting you have your way and still appeasing you. So I think sanctions are safe, but I think if Biden came in and said, I'm going to have one last go with Putin, I'm going to roll over, the present New START treaty and see whether there's any prospect of cooperation elsewhere. He'd have a lot of European support, but then if it was clear that Putin wasn't going to give anything, I think he'd have the European support saying, okay, that's it. We're really going to toughen up now on Russia.
We'll get back to that when the occasion arises immediately afterwards. In the meantime, I think the debate about what to do with Russia is going to only heat up as we get more and more information about what really the extent of this hack. And I think we've only just begun to figure out how big and large it is. But let's move on. Carol, we had another major agreement between Israel and Morocco, again facilitated by the Trump administration as part of this effort that goes under the Abraham Accords to get Israel and Arab countries to normalize relations. And it is one of those areas where the Trump administration used diplomacy, different than perhaps many of its predecessors, to get things done. How do we look at this particular agreement? It came with some interesting side deals, as all these agreements seem to have come. And what does it do for stability in the region?
Okay, so as you said, last week, still on Russia here, Morocco agreed to normalize relations with Israel, and Jared Kushner is expected to fly there next week for more discussions, apparently. And this announcement follows decisions to normalize ties with Israel by the UAE in August, by Bahrain a month later, and then Sudan in October. And they're all part of a series of agreements called the Abraham Accords that has been driven in no small degree by these countries' common perception of Iran as a common enemy. And it makes sense for many reasons. Israel is a legitimate country and it's not going away. The Gulf states have privately been meeting with Israeli officials and business people, and sometimes sharing intelligence for years anyway. In Morocco specifically, the Jewish community has deep roots there. And while there may be fewer than 4,000 Jews in Morocco today, they live there relatively safely, and Jewish tourism is encouraged. However, as with all four of the agreements, Trump's approach was blatantly transactional, awarding long-sought benefits in return for diplomatic recognition. In Morocco's case, this was manifest in Trump's decision to reverse 45 years of American policy by recognizing Moroccan control over the Western Sahara, something few other states have done. Morocco has effectively held power in the Western Sahara since 1975, when Spain ended its colonial occupation. But the local Sahrawi people still claim their right to rule a sovereign state in the Western Sahara. And the United Nations recognizes the Algerian-backed Polisario Front, a local pro-independence opposition movement, as legitimately representing these political claims. Morocco, the Kingdom of Morocco, had proposed autonomy under its continued rule, but rejected a referendum on independence. There has been a UN-backed political process for direct talks on self-determination, but progress has been stalled for years. So what's the fallout from Trump's deal-making? Many Moroccans are ecstatic that the United States has broken the logjam of recognition of the kingdom's sovereignty over the Western Sahara. The kingdom has scored a political coup, even if symbolic. Many Israelis see the agreement as further enhancing Netanyahu's reputation as a statesman, expanding Israel's international acceptance. But there are many problems, and you can look no further than the op-ed written by former Secretary of State James Baker, who was the UN envoy for Western Sahara for years, who called Trump's recognition of Moroccan sovereignty an astounding retreat from the principles of international law and diplomacy that the United States has espoused and respected for many years. This is really unusual for Baker to come out and be so critical of a sitting president's policies. Trump's declaration won't change Morocco's status won't change the status of Western Sahara under international law. Further, imposing a political settlement on independence-minded people rarely works. There are concerns that it's going to, embolden the Polisario to resume fighting with Morocco over the territory. The Polisario was already losing patience with the glacial pace of diplomacy. And now there are reports of growing anger within the group and that the members of the group, members of the Sahrawi, are feeling that they have no other choice but to resort to violence. And more broadly, with the whole pattern of the Abraham Accords, there are concerns that the United States and Gulf states have marginalized the Palestinians even further and left that conflict to fester, that Israel has forged an anti-Iran alliance with a group of authoritarian Arab states that undermines liberal democracy, and that the accords will mean a huge new influx of heavy weapons that will further destabilize the region. Plus, Algeria is not happy with this, and the Russians, it could be another opportunity for Russia to meddle and try to throw its weight around.
Thanks, Carol. Philip, how is this particular deal seen? Western Sahara, of course, is an important issue for particularly the Southern European countries, Spain, France, who are very engaged in this part of the world. But also, what signal does it send for the President of the United States to recognize the occupation of a foreign land by another country?
Yeah, well, I think Carol got it absolutely right that there are three big things here. One, overriding the rule of law. There are lots of places in this part of the world where there are unsettled. Look at Cyprus. Where there's some more heat in that part of the Mediterranean going at the moment. So the United States walking in and saying, "Well, we don't really care about the rule of law," is a big and damaging thing. I think there's a separate European concern, which is, that this is all part of the United States walking hand in hand with Israel away from any sort of deal that might be possible with the Palestinians in the West Bank. And I think the third concern is, again, as Carol said, this is a dangerous part of the world. Libya is in turmoil. In the last war between the Polisario Front and the Moroccans, the Algerians supplied a lot of the weapons to the Polisario Front. You could see that happening again. And then the Russians, who have been very opportunistic, first in Syria, then in Libya. Is this a moment for the Russians then to say, okay, we supply the Algerians with weapons to give to the Polisario Front, and we create even more trouble along the southern side of the Mediterranean? So I think on sort of practical, theoretical, legal base, on every dimension, this is a bad decision as far as Europeans are concerned.
Matt, in other parts of Washington, some are saying this may be just the first step of the next logical domino to fall, which is U.S. recognition of a possible Israeli annexation of the West Bank are all a part of it. It's already part of the peace plan. Any word that might be being considered in the White House just before they leave? And importantly, whether that happens or not, how much has the situation between the United States and Israel, and the United States and the Middle East changed so that a Biden presidency might have to start from that perspective, and how much can he change or go back to a previous set of policies?
I don't mean to make this sound like an endorsement or a rebuke of the Trump approach, but maybe just a broader point. We are so accustomed to disruption in our economic life, with our technology, and what Trump, very openly said is, I'm going to disrupt our politics, and I'm going to disrupt our foreign policy, and things that were assumed to be the way things are done. And James Baker, who Carol mentioned, is kind of epitomizes that approach. This is the establishment view of this. Trump has, even from the day one he took office, he set out to say why. So he called the Taiwanese president directly on his first day, upsetting the Chinese, and there was a lot of ingestion. He moved, but it's a lot of people say why. Taiwan's effectively been an independent country. He moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, again recognizing what is true de facto, which is Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, but complicating, the quote unquote diplomatic process. He questioned the utility of NATO in a post-Cold War world, and especially the inability of a lot of European allies to pay up. So I would say this is another of a step. As you mentioned that it's been a frozen conflict for 45 years, and I think if you're looking at the disruption school of diplomacy that Trump practices, like, why should that last for another 45 years? Whose interest is that in? And if our broader interest here is to support Israel, which it has been for presidents of both parties since Israel's founding, then what we've done by essentially negotiating diplomatic ties between Israel and several very important Arabic states, that is a win, and that's sort of a break with the way things have been going on for decades. I mean, I'm sure, I was walking down past the West Wing, past the old executive office building, and I saw the Israeli ambassador walking in. I'm sure he's paying a lot of visits to the outgoing administration. He is certainly going to miss being as influential in the Biden administration as he is presumably in the current one. But I'm also not. I think there is sort of I think to the degree that the Biden people will want to reverse the Trump approach, certainly stylistically, I do think it is remarkable to think about, what will let's leave aside the noise of Trump, turn off Twitter, turn off your cable news, but look at some of the kind of fundamental shifts you've had on China, in the Middle East, even in approaches to NATO. And Biden will not be able to come in and just say, oh, it's actually just January 2017, and I am replacing President Obama. I think Trump has created real facts on the ground that this administration will have to grapple with, and we cannot undo to the degree that some of them may wish to. And certainly the Europeans would wish them to.
Carol, jump in.
Yeah. Okay. So I agree. I don't think it would be wise to just come in and say, everything Trump did, we were going to put aside. I think you have to look at them case by case, and as somebody who's sort of looked at foreign policy for a long time, I am not opposed to creative new ways of rethinking problems, particularly when those problems are frozen and nobody, and it's deleterious to all of us that they remain frozen. But the question is, what's your strategy? How do you get from, extreme point A to some more productive solution? And I mean, just look at the North Korea situation, for instance. I thought that was a fine move by Trump to go and have personal diplomacy with Kim Jong-un. but he never able to take, Trump was never able to think beyond just sort of meeting to a strategy that was, going to get you somewhere constructive, even though his own people actually were putting before Trump a pathway that I think would have been more credible. So, the question with Morocco, I think that is one of those that may have to be, reinterpreted by Biden because of the international law aspects of the recognition and thereby if you acknowledge Morocco's control over Western Sahara, well, then why shouldn't Putin be able to take Crimea? So I think it's going to be more complicated. I agree with Matt that you just don't throw out all of what's gone past, but there's got to be more strategic goal setting for sure.
I think Carol hit it exactly there. I think Matt's right. Obviously, you need to disrupt things, but if you disrupt things in such a way as, for example, this sort of post-war sort of rule that you don't change borders with international agreement, you can't use force to permanently change borders. If you throw that one out, which is exactly what Putin has been trying to do, first in Georgia, now in Ukraine, then you're throwing out a hell of a lot of things and throwing up a lot of problems. And if the result of this is that we have a proxy war between Algeria and Morocco, with Russia on one side and the West, quotes, on the Moroccan side, next to Libya, that's a pretty heavy price for some disruption. Now, as you say, it can't just be reversed, but it can't equally, I think, just be accepted.
Matt, you want to jump in for 1 minute, and then I want to go on to another disruption.
I couldn't agree more with Philip and Carol. I don't think anyone's accused Donald Trump of having a grand strategy. I think some of the tactics are interesting in how effective they have been, but it's if you can marry kind of those disruptive tactics with the kind of grander strategy of what you're trying to achieve in the world, that I think is presumably what Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and the people coming into the White House, I would assume that they're trying to sort of think through.
Right.
Philip's talking about disruption and change and strategy or not. We are, what is the 18th? We're 13 days away from the UK permanently and forever being gone from the European Union. In fact, they're legally already gone, but the transition period ends. Vigorous negotiations going on for a new relationship. Where do you think this is going to end? And in your column today, you talked about the damage, no matter what the negotiation with the EU is going to deliver.
Yeah, I think the main point to make is whether there is a trade deal in the next 2 weeks or so or not. The big decision's been taken. We have left the EU, and we're basically going to sever all institutional relationships with the European Union from the 1st of January. And that's trade, that's security, that's education. And, many of us in this country think it's a tragic decision. It's a decision built on an idea of Britain that went out of date in the 1960s when we still thought we could be a global power. We decided we would be a European power because that fitted our sort of standing in the world. Now we've gone back to what Boris Johnson, the sort of the last Trumpian standing, calls global Britain. So I think personally there's more likely to be a deal than not. But whatever the deal is, this will be if there is a deal, it'll be unique because it'll be the first trade deal in history which consciously raises barriers to trade. At the moment, we have a single market. There are no barriers to trade or investment or anything else between Britain and Europe. Whatever happens from January the 1st, there will be protectionist barriers in the English Channel. And we Brits will go back to our, looking at ourselves and saying, there's a famous headline in the Times newspaper decades ago, which said, there's fog in the Channel. The continent is isolated. And we will, I fear, be going back to that. And we will spend 5, 10, maybe 15 years on the margins of Europe. And then we'll think again and rejoin whatever remains of the European Union, I think, in 2030. But it's tragedy and farce at once. And one of the two big decisions, post-war decisions, that Britain's made wrong. The first was Suez, when we were trying to prove we were a global power, and we, with American being pushed by the Americans, we had to retreat from Suez. We are retreating from Europe, but we cannot. Our destiny is European. We're a European nation, and you can't cut yourself off ultimately from your own continent.
Carol, in Washington, we like to make fun of the British coming in and saying there's a special relationship with London, but there's been a special relationship, not only in language, but in the intelligence and military field. And from Washington's perspective, London was the bridge to Europe. It was part of how you got into Europe.
Yeah.
Now that London isn't part of Europe anymore, what does that mean for sort of US policy towards the continent, towards the whole region?
Well, I think it makes us more and more dependent on Germany and France, for sure, and in particular, there will always be, historic ties and emotional ties with Britain, but Britain, and this has been going on for years now, and it still sort of flabbergasts me how Britain chose this path of both shrinking itself and undermining the greater role that it had in a strong and thriving Europe. So, and as a partner for the United States in all kinds of activities around the world. So I think that the United States will always seek a close relationship with Britain, but Germany and France are much bigger players now. For sure.
Matt, is that how it's seen? And you used to be in Brussels. Does Brussels? I mean, no one wanted the UK to leave the European Union, but you do have a sense that Brussels has moved on, no matter what happens in this particular negotiation.
I think from the American perspective, I think the interesting question about the Biden people is, do they associate Boris with Brexit and with Trump, and will find it very difficult to work with him or embrace him? Or is there some still role for the UK as a bridge to, as the most viable ally in NATO and as a bridge to Europe? And from what we've been trying to report out, I think you're hearing that there's nothing. The kind of the sort of transition team and the incoming foreign policy team is, as Philip mentioned, when they see Boris, they do see Trump. When they see Brexit, they see Trumpism, and they also see that the utility of Britain to America was probably no better highlighted than during the Tony Blair premiership, when Tony Blair was, from the late 90s until the early 2000s, was the most consequential and the most important leader in Europe, even with Britain outside the euro. I think that is clearly no longer true. But I still wouldn't. I think there is the other pool, which is it's a culture, a society that we know very well here. A lot of people in the administration have, went to university there, and I think there's a natural interest in the UK here, and a natural sort of affinity toward working with UK, which will always be there. and they will get a trade deal. They won't get it in the next 2 months, but probably in the next couple of years. This last thing on Brussels, from what I haven't been to Brussels since this lockdown, but I do stay in touch. I think they had the same approach from the day after 2016. This is going to be the rules that we want to uphold, and this will be our position, and we're not going to budge from it. And they've basically been consistent throughout. I do think they don't want the UK to be a nuisance, and they don't want the UK to be a competitive threat down the road. But I think Europe has also, has so many problems of its own right now that I mean, this is a great irony for me that there's no place that's just more obsessed with the EU than the UK, and probably knows more about the EU than any other country in Europe than the UK. Whereas the EU itself, I would think that the UK is not in the top 3 priorities that they currently have going forward of how you keep that bloc, still in place and much less vital.
So thanks for that, and thanks to all of you. In sort of the last 3 minutes or 2 minutes or so that we have left, 2020 has been a really tough year, probably the toughest year in all of our lifetimes in one form or another, with a pandemic and an economic crisis and a racial crisis and a real challenge to democracy, even as the climate crisis has only reared and become worse. And yet I want to ask, and starting with you, Carol, tell us one news story. Let's end this year and the show with a remembrance of some of the good things that happened in 2020 that you want to highlight.
All right, I would give 2. One, so many Americans have come to a new awareness of the fragility of our democracy, and that we need to stay engaged in order to revive it. Basically save it and revive it. And the other thing I would say is, even though the United States has been battered, and I felt we were really on the precipice of going over into an illiberal system, and therefore, the United States as kind of an example for the world has been diminished. But still, you have people in Hong Kong, you have people in Belarus, you have people in Thailand fighting for the people's voice, fighting for against autocracy, and that gives me some hope.
Philip, what's your good news story?
I think there has been one. I think there have been a number, and I think, as Carol said, democracy is still flowering in parts of the world. But I think a really big story has been out of COVID, as we've seen a demonstration of the power of science, the capacity of our scientists to look at a problem, to attack it. And basically, it looks like, I hope I'm not speaking too soon, within a year, come up with a vaccine which is at least, is, if not defeat, is going to contain this. And the second part of that is the internationalism. We've had governments around the world retreating within themselves, saying, we're going to look after our own people. We've seen scientists across the world and NGOs operating as if none of these national frontiers existed. Okay, maybe the Russians weren't part of it, but we've seen this huge international effort which has reckoned to dependency of our societies. So I'd say we've come out of this knowing from COVID seeing the reality of interdependence, but also seeing how our civil society, our businesses, can actually get together and solve these big problems. The hope has to be that we take the same attitude to climate change.
Mm-hmm.
Matt, final word.
So I was thinking back to March, and we were a lot of us were sort of digging out our copy of The Plague by Camus and reminding ourselves of what it is like to live in a pandemic. And I think that what you got from there, but from some of the other commentary, was that pandemics tend to bring out the worst in people. You look at your fellow man with distrust because they could literally kill you if they cough the wrong way, and that it's I think the good news story on it is actually this has been human nature and human resiliency has been a great year. I think we've been let's leave politics aside, but I think as societies we have been resilient and fairly unified. I think we all probably see it in our workplaces. It's remarkable how quickly our teams have adapted to to working in this way as we're talking right now, to really kind of come together and really kind of power through this. And I think, this, to my surprise, at the end of this year, it's not just that the stock market's doing great and we're economically, not that things are good, but that we're far better off than we thought we would be. That's a tribute to the good sides of human nature.
I think those are three overwhelming sentiments in terms of people power and democracy, the continued internationalism and cooperation, and the human-to-human interaction and resilience are really great ways to end what has been a tough year. The good news for me is I get to spend every Friday morning Chicago time talking to the smartest people that I know to talk about the issues that I care about. I know we all care about what's happening in the world, and to bring a little light at all the issues. So thank you all, the three of you, Matt Kaminski, Carol Giacomo, Philip Stevens, for spending the time with us. Really appreciate it this week, every week. And I wish you all not only a great weekend, but happy holidays. And I hope everyone gets some rest and spend some time, quality time with family, even if that means doing it via Zoom or Skype rather than in person. Thanks so much, all of you.
Thanks, Ivo. Happy New Year.
You too. Bye.